Hi, I'm Nate Soderstrom with the Capital Forum. I'm here today with Ken Field. Ken is a partner in the antitrust group of Jones Day. Prior to joining Jones Day in 2012, he was director of the Bureau of Competition at FTC, as well as an attorney in the Mergers 4 division. Ken, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
Today we're talking about FTC process and in particular the interaction between staff in the front office. Just to start at kind of the initial staff level, in the normal course, how is staff approaching merger reviews, and what is the process there?
Sure, it's the best place to start, obviously. Most cases come to staff, maybe not most, but through HSR filings, through announcements, other news articles, depending on how it comes through the door. Really doesn't matter, though. The process is the same. Staff will sort of immediately begin to look at potential overlaps between the merging parties and try to determine whether there's a real substantive issue that requires more analysis. Some are pretty obvious. There are some big ones in the news now. Litigation going on with U.S. Foods and Cisco, Office Depot, Staples, which is a case that everyone knows was litigated previously, and so there's a lot of interest. Those types of cases are pretty obvious when they come through the door that they're going to have meaningful issues and staff starts to gear up. But the vast majority of filings really aren't at that level and really do require staff to do some quick triage and decide which path to put them on. And at that point, one of the staff jobs, frankly, is to help keep the front office and other managers aware of what's coming through the door and what's likely to turn into something real as opposed to things clearing out and really focus the resources on what matters.
Right. So when does the front office get involved? Could it be the day a transaction is notified? Is it always post-second request? Can it be maybe not up until a week or a couple weeks before a challenge? When does the front office typically get involved?
Yeah, and it really does, in my experience, it really does vary tremendously. So of course there are the big high-profile deals that the day it shows up in the newspaper or there's any hint of it, the front office is already talking about a commissioner's potential area interested in it because it's an enforcement area that they're interested in, or they know they're getting questions already about it. So cases really can involve the front office and management from the very first day. More often, though, I would say, because again, most filings don't pose those kinds of issues, are not that high profile. More often, it comes to the attention of the front office through staff telling the front office that we started looking at this filing or we heard about this deal. We think there might be some issues, and there's a regular process by which the management of each shop meets with the front office and does a workload report and tells them, here are the things we're looking at right now. And at least in the time I was there in the front office, the point was to alert the front office that there are some things that are going to show up on your calendar, there are other things we're going to take care of, and we need to start thinking about how to deal with the more complicated cases moving forward. So hopefully that answers the question.
Right, no, that certainly makes sense. How, I guess, and I know you've worked for 3 different bureau directors, and obviously there's a current bureau director now who's different. How different are the approaches of the various bureau directors, as far as current, as far as former? Does everybody pretty much do the same thing as director of bureau competition? Do the approaches vary? How do people approach that job when they have?
And it's a great question. And again, I'll speak from my experience. Of course, there have been many bureau directors that I didn't work with, and there will be many more in the future. But there are very different approaches that people take to the job, and a lot of that is the dynamic between the commission and the bureau director. That if you have a particularly active chairperson, for example, who wants to guide the exact cases or the agenda of the Bureau of Competition in a particular way, they might take a more active role, and it might leave the bureau director in a position to have sort of less autonomy and really be trying to administer the priorities of a particularly strong chairperson, for example. In other instances, a chairperson might decide that they're trying to focus on something else. Could even be BCP, non-competition matters, could be other things, or may choose to hire a really strong bureau director and give that person a great deal of autonomy and direction-setting authority. I think we're in a period like that right now where we have a really well-known, well-respected former defense bar member in Debbie Feinstein who has taken a very active and leading role, I think, in directing the Bureau of Competition.
Right. And then as far as, I guess, substantive review of transactions, is the bureau director, I mean, I imagine in this case she wouldn't be dealing with the wording of a second request or taking like a document.
Well, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised.
but I mean, I think that's kind of the big question is, there's an idea that staff kind of does its review, comes up with a recommendation, say, hey, we should challenge this, and then it goes up to the bureau director. But I get the impression in actuality, especially kind of right now, it's more of a give and take. It's not a staff is done, now it goes to the front office, and it's more of kind of a interplay between kind of the two levels.
I think you're that's exactly right. Now, with a couple of caveats that I'll add at the end, but in my experience, and again, I was fortunate enough to actually be in the office with 3 different bureau directors and to have worked closely with others in my time in staff, and now that I've in private practice as well. And in my experience, both at FTC and DOJ, staff and the management of the different divisions or shops are constantly in contact with the Bureau. And sort of talking to them about what approach to take, about which cases to prioritize, about even just timing of when things might come up. And so there's much more of a give and take. Sometimes when you read articles or when you hear people talk about it, you get a sense that, as you say, staff worked away in a cave somewhere and did this recommendation, put it up. Now the Bureau is going to think about it and do something else. Now the Commission's going to think about it. And in my experience, they're much more intertwined because everybody's communicating all along the way.
And that certainly makes sense. How does the Bureau of Economics play in the process?
Sure.
And that's, I think, a question a lot of people do not know the answer to.
And again, I've seen it a lot of different ways. In my personal experience, I worked very closely with the Bureau of Economics. At the beginning of an investigation, an economist would be assigned to basically every significant investigation, so that from the very first phone calls you're making, from the very first investigative calls with the parties or others, you have an economist in the room with you. And they're making sure to represent the interests of the Bureau of Economics, but they're also working quite collaboratively with the attorney staff, the legal staff.
So it's not BC's doing their thing, B's doing their thing, and there's just, again, in 2 separate caves, there's an interplay, there's the investigation.
That's right. Now, I've seen it, again, I'm giving you a version, and the way I think most people would agree it's supposed to work is how I just described it. But there are those cases where views diverge early or for whatever reason, the Bureau of Economics looks at it one way, the legal staff looks at it one way, and you can't really bridge those gaps, and they become less cooperative or collaborative, I should say, and just take different approaches. And then it moves up the chain for the managers, whether in the front office or ultimately at the commission or other levels, to start figuring out how to balance the competing interests.
How typical is it for BE to have a different recommendation than the Bureau of Competition?
A different formal recommendation. I think it's not that common, but it's not a shock when it happens.
Yeah. Is it fair to say the economists are less likely to want to challenge deals in general than the attorneys?
I think that's a great question. I think that's the perception, and I'm not sure that's true. The more time I spend there, I think they have the benefit of being able to come at it as a more academic exercise and think about what's provable, what's not provable. You hear Commissioner Wright talk about false positives, the risks involved. And I think that's a fair way to put it, but the legal staff, on the other hand, often is thinking that they need to be an enforcement agency. They need to go out there and show that they're being active. And so there is a difference in their approach. But in my experience, at least, they're typically able to resolve those differences. And if they're not, it makes perfect sense. It's appropriate for those varying recommendations to be pulled up the chain and ultimately for the commission to decide. You have to remember, that's depending on who you talk to, but that's, at the end of the day, the Bureau of Competition, the Bureau of Economics, everybody at the commission works for these 5 commissioners.
Right.
And if you want to view it that way, your job is just to give the best information you can to the commission and let the commission decide. Right.
And that's a great segue to my next question, which is, when do the commissioners get involved? Is it ever early? Is it, again, BC's in their cave, the bureau director's in their cave, and then all of a sudden it goes to the commission, and this is the first we've heard of it, or are they really kind of involved in the process?
And again, that's something I've seen go very different ways under different chairmen, under different bureau directors. I certainly remember a time when the commission wouldn't be involved at all until something was sort of emerging from the Bureau of Competition. So that the chairman would sort of direct her bureau. The bureau would work up a case, and it would come up out of the bureau, and the bureau would sort of be announcing that to the other commissioners. But there have been, even in that time, I remember distinctly some very strong-willed, very strong other commissioners, even minority party commissioners who would reach out, would hear about something in the news and say, we really need to do something about this, and try to direct the policy. So it's different. Now, when do they weigh in on an actual recommendation? Usually not till pretty late.
Right.
Not
So
until
stage.
after it has come through the commission. Through the bureau offices. But, for example, the attorney advisors can meet with, the attorney advisors for all the commissioners and the chairman's office can meet with the bureau along the way to try to get updates. I know the bureau does a regular report up to the commission, I think still to this day, that says here are the things that are working their way through and when you might want to think about it, and then the commission can ask for more information about those things.
Right, and that certainly makes sense.
Yeah.
And I know you're obviously an FTC guy, but you've been in private practice for a few years. Do you see the kind of front office staff dynamic in the FTC as being different than it is at DOJ from your kind of experience and perspective, or is it pretty similar in the sense that staff does its thing, the front office is generally going to support staff?
I have a lot more insight in the FTC because I was there for so long. I can draw on my time as a paralegal at DOJ and tell you my experience there and my experience from the outside. But I just want to be clear. This is sort of limited data set.
We don't hold it.
Yeah, don't hold it against me. But I think they're mostly similar, and they're still personality driven. So if you have a particularly strong, AG over at DOJ, they may be more involved early on. They may be, again, looking at boilerplate language in a second request to say, why do we do it this way? Why do we do it that way? And be involved very early on. I do get the sense that staff over there also reports, staff meaning management of a particular division or section, still reports up regularly, does workload type reports to the front office, so that it's a mistake in my experience to think as a private practitioner that all I need to do is wait till I get to the front office and I have some more adult supervision is the most pejorative way people like to put it, and then we'll be fine. That's a mistake in my experience, that you should assume that staff is talking to the front office quite regularly, and that if you're hearing things from staff, it's likely been at least partially vetted.
It's going to be unlikely that staff is saying something.
That's right. That's right. And not that it's never happens, or that you don't get to the front office and somebody there wakes up and realizes, I don't want to litigate this one, even if we could bring the case, so that a position can change. But like I said, I think I know I've seen matters where defense counsel wants to believe that they're just dealing with crazy staff and it will all resolve itself, only to be quite surprised when it, lo and behold, they have been talking the whole time, and what you thought was crazy is the official position. So you didn't do yourself any favors by not trying to address it.
No, certainly not the case.
Yeah.
As far as remedies, the FTC sees a problem, thinks it can be settled through a consent. How involved is the front office in either deciding to pursue a settlement, as far as actually negotiating the terms of a settlement? How involved is the front office there?
And you talked about a consent. Of course, the preferred remedy is still divestiture of some sort or abandonment of the deal, right? They're actual structural remedies as opposed to conduct remedies. But again, in my experience, the front office knows what the package is before, certainly before the staff might go back to the parties, for example. That before staff fully formed its view and made a recommendation and said to the parties, we think you should consider selling the following assets. They vetted that through, at the FTC through the compliance division, likely then had open discussions with the front office about that, and so it's coming from above, not below.
Right.
I have heard more recently that the front office has engaged perhaps even more directly than in previous administrations in negotiating the terms of consent.
That's interesting. And that certainly kind of makes sense. So I think big picture, I mean, you started at the FTC 10 years, well, I shouldn't say 10 years ago, but
a while ago.
A while ago. And he, again, a number of different bureau directors, been in private practice for a few years. What has been, I think, maybe the biggest change, or what are the biggest changes in the last decade or so? Or is it fair to say that everything, as far as the way the front office is interacting with staff, has been pretty consistent, and there haven't really been many changes?
Well, that's an interesting and a hard question. I think a lot has changed in that amount of time. again, since I started there, we're on the 4th bureau director, we're on the 4th chairperson, and so and we changed political parties. So not surprisingly, there were variations, but not in the predictable ways that you might expect. You know, you can imagine Chairman Majoris versus Chairman Kovacic versus John Leibowitz versus either Ramirez. Are very different personalities, have very different agendas and backgrounds.
So was it more management style than maybe ideology or party? Is that fair to say?
I do think that's fair. Other people might disagree with me, but you can imagine, if you look at the litigation record of the FTC, for example, at the end of the last administration as compared to now, I think if you sum the cases, you'd probably say there were more cases brought during that prior period than there were in the later period. And that would be a surprise. If you wanted to use old saws to try to predict it, you would have predicted it incorrectly.
Right.
A lot of people, a lot of the defense bar in particular, is really pleased with the practical approach that Debbie Feinstein brings to this, and thinks that it's more efficient to get to those solutions, and I can't disagree with that. I'm sure some people would say she should be bringing more cases, or that the FTC should be bringing more cases, but you don't know when you're not there which cases are the right ones to bring and which aren't. At the same time, we've seen DOJ become more active in a lot of ways than they had been previously, and so there's this continued balance in the enforcement agency.
And that makes sense. I mean, at the end of the day, you can only review the mergers that are notified to you, and if some may have problems, some may not.
Right.
I think that's it. Ken?
All right.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Nate.